At 9:47 this morning, the United States crossed a line it has not crossed since the Vietnam War. Not a warning, not a congressional debate, not a Pentagon contingency memo quietly circulating behind closed doors. An actual executive order, signed by the President of the United States, activating the Selective service system for compulsory military induction. And if you think this is simply another political controversy designed to dominate headlines for a few days before disappearing into the noise of American media cycles, stay with me because what happened this morning reveals something far more serious than politics. It reveals that the United States military establishment has reached a manpower crisis severe enough that the voluntary system America has depended on for more than half a century is no longer capable of sustaining the operational demands Washington believes are coming. And the most important part of that sentence is not the draft itself. It is the phrase operational demands Washington believes are coming. Because governments do not activate conscription systems unless they believe the future requires more soldiers than society is voluntarily willing to provide. That reality changes everything. Now let me explain why this moment matters historically before we even discuss what happens next. Since January 27, 1973, America's military identity has been built around one central principle: voluntary service. The all-volunteer force was not just a manpower model. It became part of the social contract between the American government and the American people. Wars could be fought overseas without directly touching most households at home. Military service became concentrated within specific communities, specific family traditions, specific regions of the country. The overwhelming majority of Americans could support wars politically without ever expecting their own children to receive an induction letter compelling them into uniform. That psychological separation between the military and broader society shaped modern America more than most people realize. This morning, that separation began collapsing. And if you thought the administration would move slowly, giving families months to absorb the implications, think again. According to the operational timeline accompanying Executive Order 14,892, induction notices begin this week. Not next quarter, not after congressional review. This week, somewhere in America tonight, families are sitting around kitchen tables trying to understand whether their 18-year-old son could receive a government envelope within days, ordering him to report for processing. Somewhere tonight, high school seniors are checking social media trying to figure out whether college plans, careers, relationships, and ordinary life trajectories just changed permanently before they even began. And here's the part most people still do not understand. The draft itself is not the story. The story is the military calculation that made the draft necessary, because the Pentagon did not wake up this morning suddenly discovering recruiting problems existed. The recruiting crisis has been building quietly for years while officials publicly insisted everything remain manageable. Behind closed doors, however, the numbers became catastrophic. The Army repeatedly failed recruiting targets. The Navy struggled to maintain operational manning aboard deployed vessels. The Air Force increasingly depended on retention bonuses to stop experienced personnel from leaving. The Marine Corps reduced force targets simply to make recruiting statistics appear less disastrous publicly. But if you thought this was just about fewer young Americans wanting military careers, it is much worse than that. The United States military today faces three overlapping crises simultaneously: recruiting collapse, deployment exhaustion, and strategic overextension. Each one feeds the others. Young Americans see endless deployments and become less willing to enlist voluntarily. Lower enlistment numbers increase operational strain on the existing force. Increased strain damages retention. Reduced retention creates larger manpower gaps. Larger manpower gaps require higher recruiting goals. Higher recruiting goals become impossible in a society increasingly disconnected from military service, culturally, psychologically, and economically. That cycle has now reached the point where Washington believes compulsory manpower is the only remaining solution. And that should terrify policymakers far more than it terrifies young Americans receiving letters. Now stay with me because this is where the situation becomes genuinely dangerous. The administration publicly frames the executive order as a temporary manpower stabilization measure. But historically, drafts are never activated because governments expect short, limited, low-risk conflicts. Drafts are activated when governments anticipate prolonged strategic confrontation requiring sustained manpower replacement over time. World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Those were not quick interventions. They were industrial-scale military commitments consuming personnel continuously. So ask yourself the question nobody in mainstream media wants to ask honestly tonight. What future conflict environment is Washington preparing for that voluntary recruitment can no longer support? Because the answer to that question explains everything. Now, let me walk you through what happens operationally to the 18-year-old receiving a letter this week, because the human reality matters more than abstract geopolitics. The process begins with notification through the Selective Service database. Every eligible male citizen has technically been registered in since turning 18. The letter instructs the recipient to report to a military entrance processing station, medical evaluations, psychological testing, aptitude screening, background reviews, fitness qualification. Those who pass enter the induction pipeline. Those who fail receive deferment or disqualification depending on category. But this is where the system differs dramatically from what older Americans remember from Vietnam. The deferment structure is far narrower now. During Vietnam, college enrollment often provided broad protection from induction. Entire socioeconomic classes effectively shielded themselves through educational deferments, while working-class communities absorbed disproportionate conscription burdens. The administration knows that historical memory remains politically toxic. So the new framework restricts educational exemptions heavily. General undergraduate enrollment no longer guarantees deferment. Occupational exemptions are limited primarily to critical infrastructure sectors. Medical exemptions remain. Sole provider hardship exemptions remain. But the broad escape routes many Americans assumed still existed largely do not anymore. That realization alone is about to create social panic across college campuses nationwide. And if you thought the backlash would emerge gradually, you are underestimating the speed of modern information systems. Vietnam-era anti-draft movements organized through campuses, newspapers, rallies, and activist networks requiring weeks or months to coordinate. Today, outrage travels instantly. TikTok, Instagram, 10, Discord. Telegram. Within hours of the executive order, millions of young Americans already began sharing draft analysis videos, deferment strategies, legal challenge guides, and political mobilization calls online. The government activated a conscription system built for the analog era inside a digital society, capable of amplifying social resistance at speeds no previous administration ever confronted. That creates a second crisis layered on top of the manpower problem itself. Now let me explain why training capacity may become an even larger issue than recruitment. Most civilians assume the military can simply absorb large numbers of inductees rapidly. It cannot. Modern military operations are technologically complex in ways Vietnam-era warfare was not. Today's soldiers operate integrated communication systems, drone coordination platforms, advanced targeting software, cyber-linked logistics architecture, electronic warfare systems, precision-guided munitions, and highly specialized battlefield networks requiring extensive technical instruction. Training effective personnel takes time, a lot of time. Basic training alone lasts roughly 2 months, depending on service branch. Advanced occupational training can require many additional months after that. Technical specialties require even longer. The gap between receiving an induction letter and becoming operationally deployable may stretch 6 to 18 months depending on assignment category. And here is the terrifying part. That means Washington is not preparing for an immediate emergency alone. It is preparing for sustained future manpower requirements extending well beyond the next year. Governments do not invest politically catastrophic capital into activating drafts for short-term temporary optics. They do it because they believe larger military commitments are approaching. Now stay with me, because this is where the geopolitical implications become impossible to ignore. Across the world tonight, foreign governments are analyzing this executive order not emotionally but strategically. In Beijing, Chinese military planners studying Taiwan contingencies now see confirmation that American force readiness is under severe stress. An America activating conscription is an America acknowledging voluntary military sustainability has failed under current operational pressure levels. That matters enormously, because Chinese strategy depends heavily on assessing long-term American endurance capacity during extended Pacific conflict scenarios. If Washington already requires conscription before any Taiwan war even begins, Beijing may conclude the United States lacks sufficient manpower resilience for prolonged high-intensity Pacific operations. In Moscow, the interpretation differs but becomes equally dangerous. Russian analysts likely view the draft activation as confirmation that NATO's combined operational commitments have pushed American force structure toward exhaustion. Ukraine support requirements, Middle Eastern deployments, carrier rotations, European deterrence operations, Indo-Pacific readiness. The cumulative burden appears to be exceeding volunteer force sustainability. That changes Russian strategic calculations too, because adversaries watch not only weapon systems but political endurance, and conscription historically signals strain. Now let me explain why this crisis also exposes something deeply uncomfortable about modern American society itself. For decades, the United States maintained military superiority partly because only a tiny percentage of society actually bore the burden of service. Most Americans supported military strength abstractly while remaining personally disconnected from its costs. The all-volunteer force created extraordinary professionalism, but it also isolated military sacrifice inside relatively narrow demographic circles. The draft destroys that insulation instantly. Suddenly, upper-middle-class suburban families whose children planned internships, graduate school, finance careers, engineering careers, and technology careers must think about military induction personally. Suddenly, the wars discussed abstractly on television become direct household concerns. That shift changes domestic politics fundamentally. And if you thought the polarization already consuming America was severe, the draft may intensify it dramatically. Because the first question millions of families will ask is simple: what war are we preparing to fight that requires this? And the government's answer so far remains deeply vague. Now stay with me because the economic implications are equally explosive. Military drafts do not simply affect military institutions. They disrupt labor markets, universities, housing systems, family structures, and economic planning simultaneously. Employers lose entry-level workforce stability. Colleges face enrollment disruption. Families delay major financial decisions. Entire age cohorts experience uncertainty affecting consumer behavior, career planning, marriage timelines, and geographic mobility. During Vietnam, those effects unfolded gradually inside a slower-moving industrial economy. Today, they could spread almost instantly through digitally connected financial and social systems. And here is what makes the situation even more unstable. America has not psychologically prepared its population for mandatory national sacrifice in generations. Post-Cold War America developed around consumer stability, individual choice, and professional specialization. Conscription collides violently with that cultural framework. That collision is coming now. And if you thought military leadership itself feels entirely comfortable with this transition, think again. Professional volunteer militaries develop institutional cultures fundamentally different from draft-based forces. Volunteers choose service identities. Conscripts comply under legal obligation. Integrating involuntary personnel rapidly into an already strained operational force creates morale, discipline, cohesion, and readiness complications every military historian understands well. The Pentagon knows this, which means officials concluded the manpower shortages became severe enough that the risks of conscription now outweigh the risks of maintaining purely voluntary recruitment failure. That is an extraordinary institutional conclusion. Now let me explain the most important thing nobody's discussing honestly tonight. The draft itself does not solve America's actual strategic weaknesses. More personnel do not automatically fix depleted missile inventories. More recruits do not automatically fix shipbuilding delays. More manpower does not solve industrial production shortages, semiconductor dependency, rare earth supply vulnerabilities, logistics fragility, or air defense inventory depletion. Conscription provides bodies, but modern warfare requires industrial capacity as much as manpower. And America's deeper problem increasingly appears to be that its military commitments are expanding faster than both its industrial base and volunteer recruitment pool can sustain simultaneously. That is the real crisis hiding underneath today's executive order. And if you thought that was bad, it is only going to get worse from now on. Now, here is where the situation becomes even more dangerous because the draft announcement this morning does not exist in isolation. It is the culmination of every strategic pressure point that has been building across the American military system for years. Recruiting collapse, industrial shortages, deployment exhaustion, global overstretch, declining public trust, rising geopolitical instability. The executive order did not create those problems. It exposed them publicly all at once. And once a government activates conscription after half a century of voluntary service, the entire relationship between the state and society changes immediately, whether political leaders admit it or not, because mandatory service forces every citizen to ask a question democracies prefer avoiding during peacetime. What exactly does the government believe is coming that requires this level of preparation? And tonight, Washington still refuses to answer that question directly. Now, let me explain why the timing of this executive order matters so much strategically. The administration did not activate the draft during the height of the Iraq War. It did not activate it during Afghanistan. It did not activate it during the ISIS campaigns. But now, after years of simultaneous tension with Russia, China, Iran, and escalating instability across multiple theaters, suddenly compulsory manpower becomes necessary. That pattern tells us something extremely important. American planners are no longer thinking in terms of isolated regional conflicts. They are thinking in terms of sustained multi-theater confrontation, and that changes the military requirements completely. A volunteer force can sustain limited expeditionary wars, but prolonged simultaneous deterrence operations across Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East consume manpower continuously even without direct full-scale combat. Carrier strike groups require rotation cycles. Missile defense systems require operators. Logistics corridors require security. Air bases require personnel. Intelligence infrastructure requires staffing. Cyber operations require specialized manpower. Every expanding theater commitment compounds pressure across the force structure. That cumulative strain is what broke the volunteer model. And if you thought the administration would admit that openly, it will not. Because acknowledging the true scale of the strategic crisis would immediately intensify public panic surrounding the draft itself. Now stay with me, because the political consequences inside the United States may become just as destabilizing as the military implications abroad. America in 2025 is not America in 1968. During Vietnam, political institutions still retained comparatively high public trust levels even amid social unrest. Today, institutional trust has collapsed across nearly every major category: Congress, media, universities, intelligence agencies, federal bureaucracy, electoral systems. Public confidence is fragmented in ways previous administrations never confronted during national mobilization efforts. That matters enormously for conscription, because drafts require legitimacy as much as legality. If large portions of society view the draft as politically manipulated, strategically unnecessary, or unfairly distributed, resistance intensifies rapidly. And resistance today spreads through digital ecosystems capable of mobilizing millions almost instantly. Already, social media platforms are flooded with videos explaining deferment loopholes, legal resistance options, emigration discussions, and anti-conscription organizing strategies. The administration expected political backlash, but I do not believe it fully understands the scale of digital age mobilization that mandatory service can trigger. Now let me explain why military families themselves are deeply conflicted tonight. Many professional service members understand the manpower crisis is real. Units are exhausted. Deployments are frequent. Retention strain is severe. Recruiting gaps increase pressure on everyone already serving. But those same military communities also understand something civilians often do not. Effective military capability depends heavily on morale, professionalism, cohesion, and motivation. Volunteer militaries fight differently than conscript militaries. That distinction is critical. The modern American military became extraordinarily effective partly because personnel chose service voluntarily. They embraced institutional identity willingly. They invested emotionally in professionalism. Draft systems fundamentally alter that culture. Suddenly, commanders must integrate large numbers of reluctant personnel into already stressed operational structures. That transition creates friction immediately. And if you thought the Pentagon has unlimited capacity to absorb that friction smoothly, think again. Training infrastructure was built around professional volunteer throughput, not mass mobilization. Drill instructors are already stretched. Non-commissioned officer corps are already strained from repeated deployments. Housing systems are stressed. Equipment inventories remain under pressure from foreign commitments. The military can process conscripts, but processing them and transforming them into effective modern warfighters rapidly are very different things. And that gap may become the defining weakness of this entire policy. Now stay with me, because the economic dimension becomes even more serious over time. Drafts fundamentally alter labor market behavior among younger generations. Companies hesitate hiring within vulnerable age brackets. Universities face enrollment instability. Financial planning collapses for many families uncertain about future induction status. Consumer spending patterns shift. Housing markets near military installations fluctuate. Entire sectors dependent on predictable young workforce participation become unstable. Historically, wartime mobilization economies offset some of those disruptions through industrial expansion. But modern America outsourced large portions of its industrial base decades ago. That creates another dangerous contradiction. Because mobilization without industrial depth becomes extraordinarily expensive and operationally inefficient. More soldiers require more uniforms, vehicles, ammunition, logistics systems, weapons maintenance, medical infrastructure, communications equipment, and transportation capacity. Conscription multiplies pressure across supply chains already strained by global instability and strategic competition with China, which means the draft may expose industrial weakness as much as manpower weakness, and adversaries are watching all of this very carefully. Now, let me explain why Beijing may interpret this executive order as one of the most important strategic signals America has sent in years. Chinese planners have long believed the United States struggles sustaining long-term military mobilization politically. They study Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, public fatigue, recruitment trends, budget instability, domestic polarization. The draft appears to confirm many of those assessments simultaneously. From Beijing's perspective, America activating conscription before any Taiwan conflict even begins signals that Washington already doubts its manpower sustainability under current operational pressure levels. That conclusion could alter Chinese timelines dramatically, because deterrence depends partly on convincing adversaries you can sustain conflict longer than they can, and drafts often signal strain rather than confidence. Now, in Moscow, the interpretation likely focuses on NATO endurance. Russian analysts understand Europe increasingly depends on American military capacity for deterrence credibility. If the United States already requires conscription to sustain current commitments, questions immediately emerge about America's ability to manage future escalatory crises simultaneously across multiple fronts. That weakens deterrence psychology, whether Washington intends it or not. And deterrence psychology matters enormously in strategic competition. Now, stay with me because this is where the societal consequences become historically significant. For 52 years, America existed under a system where military sacrifice was largely voluntary and unevenly distributed socially. Many elite institutions remained insulated from direct wartime participation. Many political leaders advocating military interventions never expected their own families to face compulsory service personally. The draft destroys that separation. Suddenly, military policy becomes personal for millions who previously viewed it abstractly. And once wars become personal, public tolerance changes dramatically. This is why Vietnam transformed American politics permanently. Not simply because casualties occurred, but because conscription forced society itself into direct confrontation with the costs of foreign policy decisions. That confrontation is returning now. And I do not believe the American political establishment fully understands how disruptive that process may become inside an already polarized society. Now, let me explain the strategic contradiction at the heart of this entire crisis. The administration argues the draft strengthens national security by restoring manpower capacity, but simultaneously activating conscription publicly communicates vulnerability. It tells allies the volunteer system failed. It tells adversaries operational strain became severe. It tells financial markets geopolitical risk is increasing. It tells families the government expects future instability requiring expanded military readiness. In trying to solve one strategic problem, Washington may intensify several others simultaneously. That is the paradox of emergency mobilization. And history is full of governments discovering too late that mobilization itself can destabilize societies politically even before wars fully begin. Now, think carefully about what this means psychologically for the younger generation receiving these letters. Most Americans under 30 grew up in a world defined by individual choice, career customization, digital mobility, personal branding, remote work, entrepreneurial identity. The idea that the state can suddenly compel military service under threat of legal punishment collides violently with the social assumptions modern American youth were raised under. That collision will produce enormous resentment, not necessarily because young Americans are less patriotic than previous generations, but because the social contract surrounding citizenship changed fundamentally after Vietnam. Society encouraged individual advancement while distancing most households from military obligation directly. Now, the government is abruptly reversing that expectation under crisis conditions. That creates shock, and shock creates instability. Now, stay with me because the legal battles surrounding this executive order may become extraordinarily chaotic. Federal courts are already preparing emergency challenges regarding deferment structures, executive authority limits, equal protection questions, and procedural implementation timelines. Several states may attempt political resistance through administrative non-cooperation. Universities are already discussing legal strategies regarding student protections. The administration likely expected lawsuits, but mass litigation itself can slow implementation, create confusion, intensify public anxiety, and undermine confidence in system legitimacy. Again, the draft becomes not merely a military event, but a nationwide institutional stress test. And every major American institution is about to be pulled into it simultaneously. Now, let me explain the most dangerous long-term implication of all. Once conscription systems activate, governments become psychologically more willing to sustain prolonged conflict because manpower availability appears less constrained politically at first. That dynamic historically contributes to escalation persistence. Vietnam demonstrated it. Large standing mobilization structures create incentives for continued operational use. That is a lesson history repeats constantly. And if you thought this executive order means America is preparing for peace through strength, there is another possibility policymakers privately understand far better than the public tonight. They may believe peace itself is becoming less likely. That possibility changes how every adversary interprets the situation, and how every family receiving a letter interprets it too. Now ask yourself one final question. If the most technologically advanced military in human history, after decades of trillion-dollar defense spending, after 52 years of the all-volunteer force, after generations of promising young Americans military service would remain a matter of personal choice, suddenly requires compulsory conscription again. What does that tell us about the scale of strategic pressure now building beneath the surface of the global system? Because from where I sit, having spent 32 years studying military institutions and watching great powers prepare for conflict, governments do not activate drafts because they feel secure. They activate drafts because somewhere behind closed doors, planners have concluded the future looks far more dangerous than the public has been told. And tonight, millions of American families are beginning to realize that reality at exactly the same moment Washington itself is admitting it.